Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is usually known as SANHS. My name is Lizzie Induni and I'm the current chair of SANHS. This evening, Dr. Chris Smart from Exeter University will be talking about Roman to late medieval ironworking on the edge of the Blackdown Hills. Chris is an archaeologist and has been working for the last 20 years researching the landscape of southwest Britain, and has a particular interest in the Roman and early medieval periods, including how the region's mineral resources have been exploited through time. As usual, Chris will take questions at the end of the talk. To ask a question, you will need to activate the chat button at the bottom of the page and type in a question. To find the button, just run the mouse over the bottom of the screen and a series of buttons should pop up. If the button's not there, it might be at the top right or even hidden under 3 dots. Because we're recording this lecture, we won't use names at the end of the question time. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £5 towards the ongoing costs of SANHS would be greatly appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation ironwork. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to Chris.
Thank you, Lizzie. I should just share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak this evening and give one of your webinars. It's over a decade since I last spoke to the Society, and that was in person in Bath. So it's nice to be back speaking to an audience in a different county to where I usually work. Just to clarify a point that Lizzie made, my talk is actually going to really just focus on the early medieval iron production that is evidenced on the Blackdown Hills, rather than the broader chronological range of Roman through to late medieval. Although, as I will touch upon, that is an element of that landscape's history, that there is a long-lived tradition of rural industry. I will basically outline a series of excavations undertaken within and around the village of Hemyock, which is on the northwest side of the Blackdown Hills range, and then try and provide a broader landscape and social context for that activity. What I'm not going to do is run through every piece of evidence for early medieval or undated ironworking across the Blackdown Hills. So by way of context, what I really mean is I'm going to be exploring how that industry sits within its contemporary landscape, and also what it means in terms of the contemporary society and political structures. The work that I would describe originated as a commercial archaeological project undertaken by Exeter Archaeology, the then Exeter City Council's Archaeological Field Unit, which ceased trading in 2013. In 2008, it undertook an archaeological evaluation followed by open area excavation ahead of the development of a relatively small infill housing development at Churchill, which is what became known as Churchill's Rise, which was on the site of Churchill's farm. That work was undertaken as a developer-funded piece of work, but because of various reasons, the developer did not fund full post-excavation costs. So I worked with Devon County Council, who provided some stimulus funding, to then obtain a series of grants from Historic England to pursue a programme of analysis of the remains that we excavated at Churchill's farm. I should say that it was a period in time I worked for a couple of years for the Exeter Archaeology, moved from the university, worked in the commercial sector for a couple of years, and then moved back to the university and undertook this post-excavation programme and publication whilst working where I currently work at Exeter University. Published in 2018 as a BAR report, available still both in print and as an e-book. But what I hope you'll see is that it was a worthwhile enterprise in pursuing full publication of the analyses, simply because the site gave us a chance to understand not one but two industries at key points in time that are probably representative of broader activity within the Blackdown Hills. I always like to acknowledge the fact that when you deliver a talk such as this, when you're presenting a publication or the results of research, that in nearly all circumstances, the presenter is not the person who has solely undertaken that work. Our work at Churchill's Farm was very much a collaboration, over 20 people involved, archaeologists and material specialists. The archaeometallurgist, whose detailed work I will sort of synthesize tonight, is Tim Young. He's based in South Wales, and he's done extensive work on commercial excavations or the metallurgical residues across this whole region, Devon, Cornwall, and Somerset, and further afield too. A second aspect of the site, which I'll cover in a couple of slides, was a previously unrealized ceramic production industry, and the specialist team was pretty much led by John Allan and David Dawson, drawing in the skills and knowledge of others like Oliver Kent, Graham Langman, Lawrence Keane, who did some work on tile reporting, and they worked with a team from Camborne School of Mines looking at chemical analyses of ceramic fabrics, working with a chap called Roger Taylor, who's retired British Geological Survey geologist. Historic Kingdom provided some valuable input. At that time, Vanessa Straker was still in post and was our scientific advisor, and really did push for quite a comprehensive program of environmental research, and the scientific dating program, which underpins everything to do with the analysis of the ironworking that I'll present, was skillfully steered by Peter Marshall. We brought in, the intention was to have an input from Chris Dyer, but instead we worked with one of his colleagues, Matt Tompkins from Leicester, to look at medieval documentary evidence for some aspects of the industry, alongside an extra archaeology employee, Tony Collings, who looked at post-medieval documentation. So whilst I'm presenting tonight, I essentially helped organise and steer a broader group of specialists to bring this project to fruition and publication. So I acknowledge all of those individuals from the very start. Hopefully, most people in the audience will know where the Blackdown Hills are. Whilst Hemyock itself is just in Devon, the Blackdown Hills here sits in sort of the border of East Devon and Southeast Somerset, topographic range of a smaller nature than either Exmoor or Dartmoor, but nonetheless kind of geographically isolated. Today, you may pass it as you go up the M5 or across towards the A303 heading east, but to get up onto the Blackdowns is quite a task, and it's actually quite a secluded, closed landscape. I think this is possibly why it's not received an awful lot of attention in terms of archaeological research. Yet, as by the end of this talk, what I hope you will see is that it's got significant potential. My work on the Blackdown Hills started when I worked with my current colleague, who I've worked with for 20 odd years, Stephen Rippon, Professor of Landscape Archaeology at Exeter, and he obtained a grant from the then AOMB to look at analysing the whole of the historic landscape of the Blackdown Hills. And as an early researcher, myself and another colleague joined Steve to analyse the whole of the Blackdown Hills landscape. And so my introduction to this landscape really began a couple of years before the work at Churchill's Farm in the mid-2000s. So somewhat ironic that I then went on to coordinate excavations and to publish some detailed archaeology in this landscape. I've since moved to work in other parts of the southwest and focus on Roman and later medieval extractive landscapes. We weren't the first people to touch on the theme of iron working and industry on the Blackdown Hills. In the 1990s, perhaps as early as the late 1980s, Devon County Council and the then Exeter Museum's Archaeological Field Unit ran a very enterprising and successful project called the Blackdown Hills Ironworking Project, which essentially mapped most of the evidence that we currently have for ironworking remains, debris, extractive pits across the Blackdown Hills. And the distribution maps here that are presented here show the dots essentially represent evidence that isn't necessarily in situ. So sites where slag has been found, where we know that there's extraction, rather than sites of furnaces. So all of the dots on that map don't necessarily represent places where iron was smelted, for example, but it is a location where we have evidence of that industry. The key thing about the Blackdowns, for those of you who aren't that familiar with it, is that the contour map on the right shows how you have quite steeply sloping valley sides incised by a number of rivers, but very flat or almost flat plateau. And that's a characteristic that I'll come on towards the end, because different aspects of this industry are allied with different parts of this topographic landscape. The village of Hemyock is one of those nodal villages which seems to be, diplomatically to say, suffering from constant pressures for new housing. Other villages in and around the Blackdowns, as we all know, in the southwest landscape, not all villages seem to be focus of development in the way that some others are, and Hemyock is one of those larger villages which is continuing to grow. The map published here was all excavations within the historic core or immediately adjacent to the village as I went to publication in 2018. Churchill's farm here is number one of the larger excavations in the village. Excavations by Context 1 and AC Archaeology along the Colmstock Road. So for those of you who have a little bit of knowledge of this landscape, the road here is that which connects Colmstock with Hemyock, and the River Colm is just to the north of this map image at the bottom of these fields, field 982, for example. But in and around that village, there's been now upwards of 13 or 14 excavations, many of which have revealed evidence of iron waste or iron production in some form or another. I will discuss the site at Comstock Road excavated by AC Archaeology, number 11, at length, but also to point out I will discuss a site that's was excavated more recently in between sites 9 and 11, but just to the north off of this map, closer to the River Colm. Just note that Hemyock Castle Farm is in the centre of the map with the church, and there's actually iron slag built within the curtain wall around Hemyock Castle. So the fabric, and I think from memory there's slag within the church fabric as well. So literally the historic bones of this village contain evidence of iron working. So the excavations at Churchill's farm, I'm not going to bode too much on them because it's the detail that's important, but there were 4 areas of excavation called A, B, C, and D, simply reflecting the phasing that we could move through the site in the process of development. The lowest part of the site nearest the historic farm, Area A, was the largest part of the excavation that we worked on initially, subsequently moving up a series of terrace cuts, heavy truncation in some parts because of historic terracing for receiving barns. So to point out that the archaeology at Churchill's farm is an incomplete record because of prior loss due to historic farm encroachment. But there are many features here that I'm not going to discuss at all. The network of linear gullies were dated variously between the 10th and 13th century, largely using the presence of Upper Greensand derived or chert-tempered ceramics, which have that fairly broad date range. Although interestingly, some of the scientific dating that we have from the site suggests that we may have the presence of that fabric in the early 10th century. And it's quite possible that some of these gullies relate to ancillary activities around some of our metalworking. They were unconnected physically, but chronologically they could have some overlap. A range of later medieval boundaries, the more distinct and larger ditches, but I'll draw your attention to a series of large pits across the site, which were clay extraction pits. They'd been dug into the banded clays beneath and were stepped as if someone had been getting in and out of them for extracting that material. As I'll touch upon in 2 or 3 slides' time, it's what backfilled those that gave us indications of a different industry whatsoever altogether. As we moved upslope, we started to find a greater concentration of iron working debris, both within primary context, but also in secondary dumps. So some of the clay extraction pits had been backfilled with iron slag. Again, the process by which the site was excavated meant that the developer was essentially at all points chasing the team of archaeologists off site. So we had to put in place, with advice from Devon County Council's archaeologist Steve Reed, a programme of on-site sampling. So not all slag and metallurgical waste was removed from site, and it was subsampled on site, which subsequently I reflect probably wasn't the best strategy. we'd been better removing all from site and subsampling based on a set of research questions. But you learn from mistakes, particularly when they're being advised from elsewhere. The one thing we were advised to sample in full, and this is where the next slide comes in, is one of those large extraction pits, those clay pits, was infilled with probably 20 to 30,000 sherds of ceramic waste. The lower part of the site had clearly been used for dumping ceramic waste, kiln waste, from a previously unrealized ceramic industry dated to circa 1500. So this is the very end of the medieval period, sort of the period of transition, so when household consumption is changing, patterns of eating, drinking, communal eating are basically altering across much of southern Britain. It's an industry that's broadly contemporary with the Donyat industries, and I think many of the products that this industry was churning out had previously probably been confused or misidentified as being part of the Donyat industry. So this work totaled just shy of 53,000 sherds of ceramic waste was removed. We actually sampled that and took all of that off site. And you can see there's an image on here of the number of finds boxes, and that isn't the whole assemblage. And these were squirreled away beneath the stairs of Exeter Custom House whilst we worked out what to do with them. David and John put together a number of events where we basically sorted that ceramic assemblage with volunteers, members of the public, to basically whittle it down, and so we were left with an assemblage that could be analysed in a more sensible manner. And they brought in, built upon their pre-existing work over the past 20 or so years, a series of means of analysing the fabrics of that to see if we could see where these vessels were being consumed, what were the patterns of consumption across the wider southwest. So looking at contemporary assemblages from various urban contexts and rural sites. I won't go into that in detail, and the full reporting of the analysis of that is in the publication, and I think has subsequently been discussed at various points by both John and David in other publications. It's kind of an example of where a piece of analysis has added to further research on different assemblages through time. But it was an interesting process in terms of dealing with such a large quantity of ceramics. And this is one of those large clay extraction pits with steps in the side. We assumed that the clay was being used for the actual potting itself. There seems to be little other reason at this point in time for such large clay extraction pits within the historic core of the settlement. What we didn't identify were the locations of the kilns themselves, and we assume they're somewhere in the immediate vicinity. There are a number of medieval farms, two medieval farms that carry potting-related name, Potter's Farm and Crocker's Farm, from memory. It could be that some of this activity is actually just outside of the village, but that half section gives you an impression of the lenses of dumped material with one of these pits. Now, we thought that sampling 50% of that pit and taking that away was sufficient, but Steve Reed from Devon County Council, who I can now call a friend, insisted we took the rest away. We've remained friends ever since, despite the ludicrous suggestion that we remove 50,000 sherds from site. But John Allan had his revenge when quite a significant proportion was sorted and put in a skip. Anyway, we shall move on to the ironworking, which is the subject of obviously the webinar. The highest point of this site, so we're moving out of the village up towards the edge of the green sand plateau. So we're now maybe 700-800 meters away from the church, away from the impacts of the historic farm buildings into sort of greenfield landscape. This by routine was called Area D. It was the final area that we excavated, but it was the most interesting in terms of its archaeology, the smallest, the furthest away from the historic core, but it actually contained evidence for 10 in situ iron smelting furnaces, which through a comprehensive program of radiocarbon dating that I'll touch upon, dates to the late 9th to early 10th centuries. with a possible date range spanning about 65 years, but potentially that could be narrowed down to sub 10 years for the duration of iron production. I think more work on the modelling of those dates would now, with other dates from elsewhere, help narrow down the working window of this site. So we think at a minimum, we're looking at about a decade's worth of production, but it could be several decades. We're talking about two different furnace technologies here at Churchill's farm, which we assumed would be successive in terms of the development of iron production and its technology. We thought we were identifying and excavating a sequence of technological change, The earlier technology being slag pit, where you basically have a hollow in the ground, which is where your slag drops during the firing, and then a conical ceramic or clay chamber, and your bloom sits in the neck. So on this diagram, point C, your bloom of iron sits in that neck, and then you breach the chimney, if you will, and pull out your bloom, remove the slag, and if you can, repair your furnace and reuse that site. And that notionally was thought to be the early technology, which was subsequently replaced by the use of perhaps the more familiar slab tapping technology. Most people are probably more sort of familiar with the visual appearance of tap slag. It's that sort of glossy, sometimes glassy material that has the appearance of cooling under flow, and that's because essentially it has. There's no slag pit or no deep slag pit beneath the furnace itself, and instead it has an arch built into it, which is then blocked up during firing. Once the temperatures have been met, iron has been produced. You remove the bloom by unblocking the arch, raking out the tap slag, so you have a channel in front of the furnace through which the the slag flows, cools, and that's where you end up with these runnels within this material. And then you reuse your furnace by making repairs, recharging, reblocking your arch, and it all goes again. So the narrative is that one technology replaces the other. Slag pit earlier, slag tapping the next. Sorry, something just came up. So they're relatively small slag pit furnaces at Churchill's farm, and as I'll talk about, they represent a difference to what has previously been identified in this region. 5 of these slag pit furnaces, up to about 0.5 meter in diameter, but with a slag cake up to 15 to 18 kilograms. So they were a high yield for their size. Some evidence of slag flow within the basal chamber, within the pit itself, can be confused when excavating slag dumps as actually being tap slag. You do get some cooling flow slags around the wall. So for those of you who are out walking, maybe picking up slag in different landscape contexts, particularly across the Blackdown Hills, be aware that some slag that appears it has a flow element may not always be associated with tapping, because you do get it running down the pit wall, cooling and giving that appearance of being pulled out as part of a slag tapping industry. Importantly, and something I'll discuss, is that the ore itself, so the fuel is wood and wood charcoal, but the ore, the packing of this furnace to hold the ore in suspension prior to the lighting and the combustion of the furnace, it was packed with cereals. And again, that is something that is unusual for this region. The slag tapping furnaces, this says 5, but there are in fact 4. Otherwise, I don't get no. There were 5. Sorry, there were 5 slag tapping, 5 of each, but all in the same plateau. These were all on the same piece of hillside. These were fairly typical in their size. There was nothing abnormal about their scale, or indeed how the evidence of how they were used. Unlike the abnormality of having the serial packing, these didn't present any unusual technological aspects. We had very little evidence for the furnace itself, the shaft of the furnace, apart from small fragments of reburnt material, where clearly these slag tapping channels and the heads of those at the distal end have been reused multiple times. So we saw parts of old furnaces basically crushed and incorporated into the flow slags that were coming out in the final firing. And that's pretty much all I want to say about the technology, because quite honestly, it is quite a dry subject. Radiocarbon dating. The investment by Historic England isn't to be underestimated. The complex of 10 furnaces at Churchill's Farms remains the most well-dated sequence of this time period in Britain. We had 27 radiocarbon dates. The remit was that we'd take 2 or 3 radiocarbon dates from each furnace where possible, and focusing on either serials because of the short-lived chronology of a serial versus pieces of spent fuel. And actually, the ironworking, we went into this program of dating with the idea that we'd be able to separate 2 different technologies and there'd be transition, and that's what we'd investigate. But what we found was that both technological types were contemporary. There was no transition between slag pit and slag tapping. They were in use broadly at the same time. So we weren't looking at a technological transition. AC Archaeology's excavations to the northwest of Churchill's Farm on land south of Comstock Road, excavated in 2012, was a key indicator, probably the key indicator, that our site at Churchill's Farm wasn't all that was to be said about the early medieval activity or the early medieval industry within this part of the Blackdown Hills. The radiocarbon dating program being a piece of commercial work unfunded by Historic England, I think this was actually a piece of pre-application work wholly funded by a developer, so it wasn't formally at this point part of the planning process. Yielded earlier radiocarbon dates, so suggestive of ironworking, probably a good century before that we had that for which we've got evidence at Churchill's Farm. The 4 slag pit furnaces here were significantly larger, and the remains suggested that, unlike our serial pack furnaces at Churchill's Farm, these were wood packed, which is a common theme and something we also see at a site a little bit further west at Burlescombe, where we have again early dates of these slag pit furnaces where wood packing is put in use. The remnants of the dark area that you can, I'll just put a pointer on. The dark area you can see inside the hedge bank, the road to Comstock literally is just behind the hedge here, was the remains of a slag heap estimated to have in excess of 22 tons of slag remaining in situ. Now, the full extent and height of that slag heap at the time of deposition is likely to be considerably greater. So we're talking a very large volume of slag associated with an industry at this early date, sometime probably in the 700s, so in the 8th century AD. To the north of that site, the most recent excavations in 2018 again have comparative dates for slag pit furnaces of the large type wood packed. So we have multiple locations with this in this landscape, certainly from the 8th century, where we're seeing large slag pit furnaces using wood packing for the packing the ore in the chamber, and that's a significant difference, as I've already pointed out, to the technology we see employed at Churchill's Farm slightly later in time, about 100 years or so later. So Tim Young, I credit with most of the work here because he has an encyclopedic knowledge of ironworking of different periods across Britain and the continent, particularly working in Ireland and in Scandinavia, and was keen in his analysis to draw comparisons with sites beyond the immediate locality, and was desperate to try and work out why we had no transition of technology, but 2 technologies side by side. We don't have the traditional model where you lose slag pit and develop slag tapping. Slag tapping goes out with the end of the Roman period and doesn't generally come back in until pretty much the Norman conquest, slightly earlier. But we see that same trend happening elsewhere in Europe. So the key to this, he and I think, is the fact that Hemyock sits within Wessex. The Blackdown Hills were probably brought within the realm of Wessex under King Ine in the late 7th or early 8th century. And from that point onwards, we see a progression of different industries related to the production of iron. So we have these large wood-packed furnaces, the pit furnaces at places like Burlescombe, Comstock Road in Hemyock. These are paralleled elsewhere in southern Britain, Ramsbury, Romsey in Hampshire. We also have a furnace at Bywood Farm elsewhere on the Blackdown Hills that's got a similar date and a similar technology. And then we have this peculiarity, which is Churchill's farm and its date in the late 9th, early 10th century. And it sits kind of by itself in terms of technology at this point in time, but is echoed in the archaeology elsewhere in Derbyshire, Gloucestershire, for example. And there is a key point to this, which I'll touch upon towards the end. The products of these two furnace types were indistinguishable. We also thought, well, it's a slag pit furnace producing a type of iron different to the slag tapping. Tim was able to ascertain that was not the case. Both were producing high and low phosphorus iron. They have different properties. One's good with hardness, one's a bit more malleable, ductile. So they're used for different tool types. So our transition of technology wasn't sort of valid. The production of different forms of iron, again, seems to have been something that wasn't the case between these two furnace types. In terms of the packing, the cereals that we used to pack the charge of ore inside these furnaces, the key thing to point out that it seems to be a mix of materials: barley, rye, wheat, some oats. Now, Vanessa Straker and Julie Jones and Vanessa, both now retired, did quite a lot of thinking about what that may mean, and have we got representing of different crop regimes, crop cycles within this landscape, or potentially does actually this material all come in one group and is known as something as a maslin crop, which is essentially a coverall crop to basically hedge your bets, and it's something that's still actually, I think, widely used in parts of Scotland, where you basically have mixed arable crops in case of effects that one doesn't germinate, etc. Some grasses within that material may just be weeds. The crops hadn't been cleaned, so they may be coming prior to being threshed. The material could be coming prior to being threshed. The amount of wood for charcoal is going to have been significant, and it's suggested that based on some of the roundwood that we're looking at a coppice cycle of a 12-year, not a 6-year cycle. So it's kind of a double traditional coppice cycle. So they're looking at slightly larger roundwood material rather than the smaller. In terms of how this industry in the late 9th, early 10th century sits within its contemporary landscape, I draw now upon some of the work that Steve Ripp and I and our colleague then Adam Wainwright did as part of our analysis of this landscape in the mid-2000s. We were doing it in the mid-2000s. We weren't analysing the landscape of the mid-2000s, I should add. So James Bond and his work on woodland suggested that to produce a ton of iron, you'd have basically had to have 0.8 hectares. And I think for ease, if we think of a ton of iron requiring charcoal from a hectare of woodland. Now, a hectare, for those of you who aren't metric, is 100 by 100 meters, or roughly 100 by 100 yards. That gets you 1 ton of iron. Now, there's a sequence of calculations that we worked through a few times to try and work this out, and sometimes I still struggle. But by looking at the yield of slag, you can work out the amount of iron that was produced. So for example, 1 kilogram of iron, you end up with 2 kilograms of slag. It's kind of a 50, 1/3, 2/3 sort of ratio. So the slag cakes that I've talked about, 15 to 18 kilograms, an 18 kilogram slag cake essentially is associated with a bloom of iron, roughly 9 kilograms. So for 100 tons of iron, 1 ton of iron, you require circa 100 smelts. So for every hectare of woodland, you're getting 100 smelts of fuel. Now, going back to the slag heap, which is probably the best excavated and quantified at Comstock Road, 22 tons of slag that were left in situ following 1,400 years of truncation. you're looking at 11 tons of iron potentially produced from that industry, or what's represented in the slag heap, 1,100 smelts, and therefore around 9-10 hectares of woodland. So that's a band of woodland being used that's 100 meters by a kilometer in length. And I think what this is pointing to, with the number of sites that we have by chance during commercial work discovered. So these aren't sites, and we must remember this, that we've set out to find. These have all come about through decisions about development and new housing in today's world. We've not sought to find these sites, so they are essentially found by chance, which means there are probably many, many more of them that remain undiscovered. So the implication is that the impact on woodland, with the potential scale of this industry, is significant. On the images, the map on the left, the darkest areas that are shaded in our color scheme, this is a means of color coding the landscape into different landscape types or zones or phases of chronological development. But the dark areas here are extant woodland. On the late 19th century Ordnance Survey first edition maps. Now, it is clear from what we understand about the quantity of woodland required to sustain this industry from the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries, that the extent of woodland along these valley sides must have been considerably greater than we had historically. So we have an industry that is operating probably on the edge of quite a significantly wooded scarp below those plateau environments. All of the slag find sites that were identified during the work of the Blackdown Hills ironworking project actually sit on those valley sides. So it's a way of confirming the value of that valley side woodland to those producers of iron in both the early medieval and post-Norman conquest period, when we know there was a renewal of iron production in the 1200s and 1300s. There are notably few examples of slag found upon the green sand plateau. It is all on those intermediate sloping valley sides, not in the valley floors necessarily, but closely associated with those formerly wooded slopes. And it's possible that those industries are moving around their local landscape to be in closer proximity to the next cycle of coppice woodland. That's one thing to bear in mind, that our multiple sites may be moving around, albeit within 5, 10, 12-year time periods, to move nearer to the next area of woodland that's available for a coppice cycle. That we obviously don't know for sure, but there's quite a significant chance that that is the case. But the key thing is that iron production at this time was an integral part of this rural economy. It wasn't pushed to the edge. It was within a managed landscape that was agricultural, industrial, and also partly wooded. The supply of clay for those furnaces, we tried to quantify, and based on experimental archaeology, it could be seen that about 300 kilos of clay would have been required to construct either form of furnace, with up to about 10 kilos used for repair, more needed for repair of the slag pit furnaces than the slag tapping, which if the smelt went well, you'd only require to reblock the arch, versus more significant damage to the slag pit furnaces. We turned to the late 19th century records of clay pits, but also looked at Lidar data. And at this point, the Lidar data was still relatively coarse in its nature, to map extractive pits in the immediate location. Now, these may be clay and marl extraction pits associated with agricultural improvement. There was no way of proving that these were indeed associated with clay extraction linked to the need of an iron industry, nor indeed linked to that sort of late medieval, early post-medieval ceramic industry. But what was clear, and hopefully in the bottom right image you can see, is that nearly all of the pits within this landscape, which are undoubtedly clay extraction pits, seemingly were integrated within the historic fieldscape. There are very few sat isolated within sort of the center of a field. Now, this means one of two things. Either these are being dug. Unfortunately, it means one of two things that aren't very helpful. It means they're either dug at the edges of existing fields, so that they don't cause a problem to the use of a farmer, or that when the field boundaries are laid out, they're being laid out to respect existing divots and hollows within this landscape. So unfortunately, unpicking a chronology based on relationship with historic field boundaries is actually a pretty meaningless exercise, despite it being something that we thought could have potential. My last few slides are really to do with the ore that was used to create the iron. This is where that plateau environment, the green sand plateau, comes into play. And across there, you have clay with flint sat upon the green sand, and within that, you have nodular iron ore, iron oxide ores. And it's these nodules that were dug and then smelted, and we have evidence for both Churchill's Farm and Comstock Road, chemical signatures that link the blooms with these nodular iron sources upon the green sand plateau. Pretty much an obvious thing to have proven, but it may be that as we move with scientific advances, we'll actually be able to identify where exactly specific furnaces were extracting using iron ore, some specific parts of the plateau. But what we'd need for that is a greater number of excavated iron ore extraction sites across the plateau environments. And the images here actually are the work of the museum's field unit in the late 80s and 90s. Looking at and excavating a number of these iron ore extraction pits. Some of them are fairly deep, sort of up to 2 meters, surviving up to 2 meters, but the key thing is that many of them are intercutting, suggesting that there's repeated sourcing of nodular iron within this landscape. These weren't isolated one-off events. To reiterate that point, and we're going to look at both Dunkeswell Airfield and further south North Hill and Broad Hembury, is that Lidar data shows a very mottled landscape, which means there's many undulations across that landscape. The area of the airfield, when it was scalped pre-war for the creation of the Second World War airfield, with the use of high resolution LiDAR, you can actually still make out the subtle depressions of thousands of iron ore extraction pits, despite the truncation caused by the Second World War and its necessity for creation of the airfield. So beyond the bounds of the airfield, you get significant earthworks visible on LiDAR, but still you can see them across the airfield itself. Cotswold Archaeology undertook a piece of work to the north of the airfield, and all of the yellow dots on this geophysical survey interpretation each one of those dots is a iron ore extraction pit, a small number of which they sampled, all of which were undated, which doesn't help us link with any particular phase of industry, but to say that all of this extraction probably can span anything from the mid to late Iron Age through to the late medieval period. But there are literally hundreds of thousands of these iron ore extraction pits in this little discrete part of the Blackdown Hills landscape. North Hill Common in Broad Hembury, again, you can see agricultural improvement, late enclosure, and so an attempt to bring common into cultivation, but many remnants, many earthworks associated with these ore extraction pits. An aerial photograph from the DCC aerial photograph shows the undulations, the irregular texture of that landscape from the air, and that is in relation to all of the ore extraction. So we've got Hemyock as a settlement with multiple episodes of iron smelting. Should also say that in the immediate vicinity of Hemyock itself, Tedborough Farm is a site name where you've got evidence of dated Roman slag. So we've got production in the Roman period. We did actually have a small amount of Roman pottery from Churchill's Farm, but none of the evidence suggested that was linked to the phases of ironworking that we had represented. So we're looking at a multi-period landscape, and we've focused in on those few centuries of the early medieval period tonight, simply because they're the best excavated remains and the best evidence we currently have to understand one time slice of this industrial landscape. Coming back to Tim's work to look at different furnace technologies, and this is where I kind of now wind down towards the end. This is something that archaeologists are often loath to do, which is to try and fit archaeology to neat historical timelines. But Tim's quite right in observing that we have a peculiarity Churchill's farm in the technology, these small serial packed furnaces, which only have parallels elsewhere and notably outside of Wessex. Hemyock was certainly a royal manor. My colleague Steve's written a book about this landscape, or the broader southwest landscape, and explores the idea of early folk territories and early medieval estates, one of which is centered around Hemyock, another around Cullompton and Broad Henry. So we've got different political structures in the early medieval period playing out in this landscape, and at least 3 of those early territories basically converge on the Greensand Plateau to the south of Hemyock around Broad Henry and Dunkeswell. And you do wonder whether the division of this landscape across this plateau is linked to the sharing or the fair division of this mineral resource between these early medieval territories. One thing to consider. The other thing is the key distinction and the tight date range we have for production at Churchill's farm with that peculiar technology. The smelting at Churchill's farm pretty much ties exactly with the reign of King Alfred the Great, and his son Edward the Elder. And it's a period in time when we know that there was many enterprises undertaken, particularly by Alfred, in the creation of burghs, formation of a naval fleet potentially. But we also know that Alfred was keen to bring in expertise from outside of Wessex, so bringing skills from Mercia and the Carolingian Empire. And Tim, I think, sensibly moots that is our technology here Churchill's farm Hemyock, which is peculiar for Wessex and peculiar for this region, actually associated with a skills base or a knowledge base from iron workers brought by Alfred or by his son Edward from outside of the realms of Wessex. These are technologies and methods that won't have been learned instantly. They are transferred through time. And I think it's quite probable that based on the presence of this activity at Hemyock, with it being a rural manor, we may be actually seeing the import of specific skilled craftsmen, industrial workers from outside of the realm of Wessex, or certainly brought from elsewhere within Wessex to deploy their skills here on the Blackdown Hills. Antecedents, I've talked a little bit very briefly about the fact that we had a little bit of Roman pottery at Hemyock, at Churchill's farm Hemyock, and there's a slag heap from just outside the village dated to the Roman period, to the 2nd century. One thing that in that early work that I did on the Blackdown Hills with Steve and Adam, this was before the days of lots of digital maps, and on the wall of my office at the time I'd printed out the 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps and stitched them all together, and I had them above my desk so I could look at the Blackdown Hills and ponder it. And one day, probably while having a coffee or eating lunch, I noticed something that stood out as an anomaly in this landscape. So one of the areas I've just described as being full of ironworking, iron ore extraction, North Hill in Broad Henry, is this plateau here. So we're moving down a slope southwest. If you keep going southwest, you eventually arrive in Exeter. Now, I've put 2 red stars here to start the ball rolling to draw your eye, but there is an alignment within this landscape that sits uncomfortably across the grain of the fieldscape, and it stretches pretty much in a directly straight line to this very rich source of minerals, the nodular iron ore on North Hill, and heads directly towards Exeter. I have no other evidence, despite searching at the moment, to suggest this, but I'd be very surprised if that isn't the remnants or the legacy of a Roman road running from the Blackdown Hills towards Exeter, probably directly associated with the extraction of ores on that plateau, and perhaps associated with the movement of finished iron as an end product. Now, I've looked at LiDAR, more recent LiDAR, new LiDAR, remodeled LiDAR, to see if I can find any other earthwork traces, and I cannot find any at all. But you don't get dead straight lines in landscapes that run for 5 kilometers, 3.5 miles very often. It's either that or some very, maybe an early territorial boundary that hasn't become part of the Paris structure. But it's a very unusual feature, and I think hints to the importance in the Roman period of this part of the Blackdown Hills within the broader Roman hinterland of Exeter. But that's another component of the potential for research in this landscape. So my final slide really is just a summary of what we already knew in the 1990s. We have been lucky enough to excavate what turned out to be a well-dated early medieval iron production centre. Other colleagues at commercial units have done likewise, but we are doing so in reaction to development. We are not pursuing this topic for any periods through a structured program of archaeological research, or one that is designed with the outcomes of knowledge at its heart. And so I kind of think that the words of Francis Griffith and Pete Weddell are still actually highly relevant, which is that the scope of the results so far obtained and the high quality of the information that has been obtained indicate that further work on this project is merited. So from the words written in the 1990s to now the mid-2020s, I don't think the state of our understanding of the entire Blackdown Hills and its full potential is actually fully realised. And I will leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, that's left me with a load of questions. I didn't think it was going to be such a massive. It's plainly a huge business, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
I thought you were just excavating, something local, maybe some little bloomery furnaces from a local farm, but it's nothing like that at all.
And to be honest with you, Lizzie, that is what I realised through.
Yeah.
But just before probably leaving site, when discussions were starting to start, which was frankly why I quite doggedly pursued this for publication. It could quite honestly be an archive that was just left with the closure of a field unit, no one willing to pay for it. But both John and David, in regard to the pottery, and myself and Tim could see in terms of the metalworking that this actually had the capacity to be a really informative excavated sequence if given the correct treatment. And again, many thanks to Historic England for spending a not insignificant amount of money to allow us to bring that to publication. But yeah, it isn't just a cottage industry.
No.
Whilst there are individuals involved that may have been local, we are seeing it's got a bigger sphere of influence, but it is also a huge enterprise. And the tantalizing thing is it's not just during these 2 or 3 centuries. We know, for example, work that was done as part of the Blackdown Hills National Landscape. One of their projects, radiocarbon dated slag from around Dunkeswell Abbey. That's come back with a Roman date. And there's nice documentary evidence, I think, for iron workers, possibly in Doomsday, for example. So the whole landscape, in terms of the iron industry, has massive potential, and that's before you even get started on the later ceramic industry and indeed the early medieval ceramic industry.
Absolutely. So they must have been exporting. I mean, they weren't just sort of making little pintles and things for doors, were they? They were plainly doing something much bigger.
Yeah,
and it takes so much effort to get a small lump of iron out of a bloomery furnace. It's a huge amount of work, and you're always burning so much charcoal to get it. And then this little tiny nodule turns up after about 3 hours work. The thought of getting a ton of iron, they must have been at it all over the place.
Yes, and constantly. I mean, one of the things to consider is that whilst it seems that we have specialists producing, smelting, maybe people that are resident within that landscape who are occupied as their main of their occupation is farmers. Maybe they are also engaged within iron ore extraction as a lesser skilled thing. Maybe it's filling in void parts of the agricultural year, potentially. And in later periods, historians refer to the miner come farmer model, but maybe we do see it in an earlier period, although we don't have the documentary references for it. But you're right. I think if the evidence, which again I must say is by chance found at Hemyock, not through design, if that is likely to be replicated over and over again, and Hemyock isn't the only royal centre, and we see actually across Wessex and parts of Mercia, we see that actually these royal manors seem to always they're the places that are yielding this evidence for ironworking. So yeah, I think there's quite a long tradition of this being this material being, which we think of actually as being quite mundane, being really important to a significant episode in history. I mean,
iron is never mundane. We just got used to it in modern times.
Yes, iron in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 5th century is the plastic of today. What?
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
And the effort to get it is so phenomenal,
Mm,
isn't it?
mm.
I'm, yes, I'm quite reeling with a lot of questions, really. Do you suppose that the people who were running the furnaces were specialists who were moving from place to place? Were they like journeymen? Or were these people who were living in the vicinity?
Itinerant is an idea,
Mm.
especially if we have multiple centres run under the auspices of a royal enterprise. It could be that they are going from place to place as a new stock of nodular iron ore has been extracted.
Or when, more importantly, where the wood is coming from, because you're always trying to get more wood, and that's always the thing that people are chasing with ironworking.
Yeah, and the traditional narrative is that it is, despite the weight involved, you move your ore to your charcoal because of the issues of
Yes,
fragmentation of that. Now,
absolutely.
I still think that holds true. But it's particularly because of where you're starting to seeing smelting in, not just on the Blackdowns, but in many parts of industrial landscapes. It does seem that ore is taken to the point of
Oh, absolutely.
the
You look
charcoal or
at
the.
Barren Furnace, and they were exporting iron because the quality of the iron from Barren Furnace is fantastic, and they took it all the way up to Scotland
Mhm.
because some marvelous landowner in Scotland thought, oh, got all these trees, we can use it to make
Yeah,
iron,
yeah,
which they did. But I mean, that was quite a long distance, but it
yes,
worked for
mm,
years.
mm,
You
yeah.
have to get to the timber rather than the
Mm,
other way around.
mm. I mean,
Yeah,
for me, one of the interesting things is that knowing that we've got radiocarbon dates for suggestive of iron production. I mean, they're not of furnaces that go through the Roman period, and then we're getting with every excavation, we're getting that little bit further back in the early medieval period to the 8th century. When is that gap going to close, and is it going to close, or do we have a genuine hiatus when the landscape's resources aren't put to use in the way that we see before and after the 5th,
yeah.
6th, parts of the 7th century? That's I think this landscape can offer insight
Mm.
into that, but it will take more chance finds from excavations.
Yes, it's a hard one to sort of deliberately. I mean, does Lidar actually give you anything about this, or has anybody ever tried even?
No, no. I mean, all we can get from the lidar is an assessment of the extent of extraction on the Greensand Plateau,
Yeah.
and I think all of our early work to do with the historic landscape analysis was pre lidar, and it would be. I know that Devon County Council worked on a Blackdown Hills aerial mapping project, which had some bespoke lidar commissioned. But it would be worth returning to that landscape with a fairly cursory view to kind of assessing the overall extent of nodular iron.
Absolutely. Yeah. Gosh, it's really quite exciting. Oh, I've got questions coming through, and out there in Radio Land, don't forget to come and put your questions up on the chat button. Um, this business of cereals, I can't quite get the hang of what were they doing with cereals in their kilns? Were they using the cereals for firing? What
No,
was
so
all that
the
about?
so your the it will always be timber or charcoal for the fuel, but
Yeah,
then you've got to basically pack your ore so it sits above your charge of fuel. So you've got
right.
to suspend your ore. So as the furnace heats, your ore basically drops into the through the chamber to go through the process of conversion from iron oxides into metallic iron. And so those larger slag pit furnaces in particular, they're using split wood to do that, which essentially then
Oh,
gets combusted. But here at Churchill's farm, what we have is the use of cereals to basically hold that charge of ore in place while the firing process begins. And that,
right.
at the moment, it is the only example of that in this area or in this wide region. And you say the comparators are actually from outside of the heartlands of Wessex. Perhaps this is why, and this is why Tim is suggesting that we may be seeing Mercian expertise being brought in, because it's the type of furnace that we see evidence in archaeological record in Mercia. So, I
Wow.
mean, this could easily all change with another excavation that finds a similarly dated set of furnaces that have got wood packing. But yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, there's a lot to think about there. Hmm. So I've got a question here. Is there anyone using these traditional methods on the Blackdowns now, either as reenactment or to keep methods alive?
Yeah, I think that there was an experimental archaeology centre somewhere not too far away, maybe on the northern scarp of the Blackdown Hills, where there was sort of early craft technology that was being undertaken. I don't know whether that's still going on. I suspect that is it Wildwood Escott? I think there's a Saxon village reconstructed, which is on the southern side of the Blackdowns, and I would imagine that they've got experimental iron smelts as part of that reconstructed visitor experience.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen it done, and it's relatively simple, but takes a surprising amount of skill.
Mm.
You think it's going to be quite simple, but as with the firing all kilns, it takes a certain amount of skill,
errors before you learn what not to do.
You learn. Hair dryers have to be employed to blow air at the bottom end. Oh dear. So we don't know how long iron production kept going in this area, do we? Do you think well, you're thinking back to Roman times, probably.
Yeah. And then beyond, there is medieval documentation. I'm pretty sure that I can't remember whether it's records associated with Dunkerswell Abbey or whether it's a Doomsday. There's mention of iron workers or payment of iron workers. In probably I think it's the 11th century, maybe 12th century. I can't honestly remember, but certainly we're going into the high medieval period. There's definitely active production. We did actually have from later dated contexts slag of a different technology, which, because of the fact that it wasn't well dated, we didn't commit to analyze, but it was suggestive of one of those later high medieval industries. So again, there is likelihood that the iron was being produced in around Hemyock post the Norman conquest as well.
I guess they'd probably do it till the iron ran out. I mean, why would you stop? It's such a useful commodity.
Yeah, I mean, and interestingly, the iron hasn't run out because you can still dig holes and find iron ore on the plateau. So, what did other sources from elsewhere that were easier to access or yielded larger volumes of ore? I as part of the process of talking to Tim about whether we could further the idea of ore provenancing and linking it with specific furnaces to see if there's to kind of follow up that idea that you might have early folk territories or early territories that had their own allocation of the resource.
Yeah.
Could we look at it? Well, the answer to that is we'd need to go out and excavate iron ore from different areas from scratch. And he basically said, if you want to do that, be my guest. But
that's tricky.
It is.
You're going to be walking around there for years.
Try and convince people to go and dig holes to find one or two grotty bits of nodular iron ore.
Yeah. I did try that one weekend, looking for iron on the iron, and it's not easy. Yeah. You need to know where to look in the first place. Oh, the pots that you found, I was very interested. Are these just wasters? Why did you find pits full of masses of pots?
Yeah, I mean,
what's all that about?
It's all, I mean, there are fused bowls, there's heavily distorted vessels, and it does appear to be waste. So these wasters, are failed elements or whole failed firings. And the lenses certainly within that one large clay extraction pit does suggest that it's being carted to site, tipped in. Maybe it's going in over a period of time rather than, it's certainly not single event dumping. But the location of where that industry is still an enigma. There's a place called Pit Farm in Colmstock where there's good evidence from collected ceramic waste that there's probably an industry there. We have these Crocker and Potter farm names to the east of Hemyock, and then you have Clay Hyden as a parish, and that has some good medieval documentation, which is what Matt Tompkins looked at quite heavily, linking sort of the 1300s, linking with ceramic industries. So we have physical evidence at Hemyock, but we sit kind of in between an area where we've actually got documented evidence and a true kiln site. So somewhere, I'm sure, in Hemyock, there is a kiln site to be discovered.
I mean, the whole story that you're telling is showing an image of the Blackdown Hills as a heavily industrial place. You've got pot kilns, you've got ironworking. It is not this sort of nice lush bit of
Yeah,
grassland
yeah,
and
not
trees
necessarily
that you've got
quiet,
today.
quiet green,
Yeah,
yeah, landscape with spring lambs bouncing around in
hedges
the fields.
and
Yeah, no,
yeah, it
absolutely.
wasn't like
There
that.
must have
It
been a
was
little bit, at all times, there must have been a little bit of competition for what spaces in that landscape were used for the different purposes,
yeah,
because they were all must have had an economic importance either to
yeah,
the local communities at that time, but also to the overruling elites at the various times as well. Um,
yeah. Heavily industrial Blackdowns. I think that's a really good image to leave us with, don't you? And I really wish you best of luck with getting further funding for this very interesting and exciting project.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Lizzie.
And thank you very much. I think it's been really fascinating. I certainly enjoyed that. So we have a few bits of information to hand out about next events at SANHS. On Saturday we've got Chris Webster's Stopline talk, but that's now fully booked, which is always a lovely thing to have achieved. Our next webinar at SANHS will be on the 14th of March, where we're talking about the extraordinary ceramics collection found in a cellar at Wells Museum. So that's the 14th of March in 2 weeks' time. And on the 20th of March, we're very, very excited to announce that the Wyndham Hall, the odd little building next to the museum in Taunton, is now open for the first event. And Mary Sirrow will be giving a lecture about booze, blood and baskets, what I think is something about electioneering in Taunton. So 20th of March at the Wyndham Hall, a live presentation by Mary Sirrow. Lots of our associated societies are all very busy at the moment as well. And they've got, also, you'll be able to have a look on the website, the SANHS website, but Yeovil Archaeological and Local History Society on the 1st of March, that's tomorrow, we're having a talk about Mick Aston, Julian Richards and Phil Hardy. On the 2nd of March, that's Saturday, Froome Society for Local Study is having a talk, Victoria County History of Somerset, and that's Mary Sirrow again. The Historical Association, the Taunton branch, is having a talk on Wednesday, the 6th of March, about how to be a Democrat in classical Greek city. And finally, on the Friday, the 8th of March, Wells Natural History and Archaeological Society are having their AGM, followed by a visible history of King's Castle Wood. Okay, well, thank you very much for being there. I'm sure you've enjoyed the lecture this evening. And thank you, the webinar team, Nathanael, Allan and Tony are all back there backstage and we never see them. And thank you for joining us, and we'll hope to see you all at the next webinar on the 14th of March. Thank you and goodbye.